Yo, what's good, my Menace Society? It is your host with the most, Shadow Look, back at you with another video. Make sure you guys like, comment, and are subscribed to the channel. It's absolutely free. That is how you help my channel get into the algorithm. Highly appreciate if you go ahead and do that. Now, what I want to talk about is something that actually happens a lot on social media, right? Which is the disagreement, right, with content creators who put out content exposing or pointing out people's lies or hypocrisy, and those who are with the content of the individuals that are peddling that type of content, right? Um, some examples is like, you know, Carlos Mencia and Joe Rogan. Before Joe Rogan was actually who he is now, right? It was said that Carlos Mencia would steal other comedians' jokes, right? And pass them off of his own. Joe Rogan, would point this out along with other comedians, right? But they weren't as big as Carlos Mencia. Carlos Mencia at the time had his own show. He was the big times, right? And these individuals were still nobodies, right? They still Joe Rogan didn't have his podcast, so this is before all of that. And he would call him out on it, right? He even confronted him one time in the while he was doing his stand-up comedy, right? And put him out on blast. There's footage out there that was recorded and leaked, right? But in the beginning, everybody was against Joe Rogan and pretty much siding with Carlos Mencia until social media came along the way, right? And then now people were starting to become more aware of this information that Carlos Mencia was now in the hot seat, right? And now everything he had built was starting to crumble and fall, like it always does, right? But it's funny how in the beginning everybody was siding with him just because of how big he was, right? Like he was the man that people automatically assumed that he had to be the one telling the truth, and this small fry, this guy, who's nobody, was clearly the one that was lying. When in all true reality, it was the other way around, right? And that tends to happen a lot. A lot of people focus too much on the size of channels or the size of somebody's empire, right? And think because it's large, or they have accomplished so much, that they can't be the ones that are lying, or that they can't be the ones that are actually the the ones that are in the wrong here, and that the small guy must be jealous, that must be what it is. When in all true reality, these individuals know that that's how it works, right? And they use that as their advantage, right, to call out people for jealousy or envy. You get me? Because it looks like that from the outside looking in, right? But that's not necessarily the case, right? And he found out the hard way, right? With that, same with Hulk Hogan, right? When he was the man on top, right? But now everybody sees his lies and everything. Everybody now pointing out his lies, and this is not something that's new. This is something that people had been pointing out for a long time, since a long time ago. But they were called haters and envy, and but it turned out to be all true, right? When social media got out, people started seeing Hogan's true colors, and started to see him for what he truly is. And this is something that continues to happen. Like with example, Mr. Beast and that guy, Underdog or whatever his name is, right? Who exposed for some of his videos being fake, even though Mr. Beast says that they're not fake. But he pointed out the evidence, and the evidence doesn't lie. You get what I'm saying? But like I said, people choose to want to silence these individuals for being smaller channels or smaller, in success, right? And being the ones that are in the wrong, when in all true reality, where they're just pointing out these people's, shadiness or shystiness, the shady moves that they pull off, pulling a fast one on individuals, right? Playing them pretty much, and like there's people out there that would say, well, I mean, hey, the game is dirty and you got to do what you got to do, right? But when you're trying to pass it off when you're trying to pass yourself as somebody who's honest and somebody who's actually um, genuine with what he's talking about, right? Then you can't be going around and busting these moves and then get mad when people are not calling you out for them. You get what I mean? Like Carlos Mencia was doing with Joe Rogan. So this is not something that's new, or that only happens in certain genres, but it happens throughout every genre of content. Video games, sports, comedian, even people that react to movies, or calling out other individuals for stealing their ideas or manipulating and lying, about what they're talking about. So this is not something that just plagues, how can I say, the what people consider the prison genre, the street genre, the taboo genre, or the yarda, whatever they call it, right? Um, but it's something that exists, through every kind of content. And that doesn't make people haters or envious or jealous. You know what I mean? If they're bringing, facts and proof, it is what it is. Because I seen an individual had left on one of my videos that actually had actually nothing to do with what he left in the comments. Right? He had said that um, there's a content creator, right, Chemoflix, who subscribes to Chemoflix channel, and he disrespected his channel by calling them, putting a title on him, right, as like a chomo or something like that, like chomo flicks or something like that. He called them, right, and that why did I comment and why do I side with his content, right, and that he's just a hater, and I found that comment, amusing because if people who watch ever Chemoflix channel, Chemoflix never ever talks or show himself, right? He literally just grabs the individual's words, the ones he's reacting to, and replays them, right? For people to home in on what they just said. Like, well, these individuals said, one thing, but then here's them saying the opposite, but using their own words. It's not AI. It's not, like altered in any way. It's literally clips of these individuals' very own words against them, right? So it's like, how could you say somebody's a hater when they're not even talking or like, or anything like that, right? They're just using these individuals' very own words, right? So if these individuals look bad because of what they're saying, then, well, it's because it's bad of what they're saying. But that's not his fault. You get what I mean? But people can't be mad because he chooses to, point it out, right? And he had mentioned several other channels, right? Breaking the Cycle with Slugs and, a few others. And it's like, well, you can't be mad at individuals for merely, coming and speaking facts, though, and pointing out the hypocrisy. That's not hating, that, how is that hating, though, in any type of way? And like I said, and they're not the only ones, right? Like I said, there's other people, and like they were, siding with the bigger channels because the individual had said, you think if these individuals had, this many subscribers or this many, their channels being this big, that they would do what these people say that they do. And it's like, don't ever be fooled by the games that people play because people who deceive are really good at it. They've been doing it their whole entire lives. They know how to play the game, right? So they know how to make things seem like what they aren't, right? And you're pretty much being a victim. You're falling into that, into their con. But there's individuals out there that refuse to want to see that they're actually being played or fooled or con, right? They would like to think that they're actually sharp enough to be able to see the lies. But like I said, there's individuals that are good, right? And you can't always, believe what you see and hear on the internet, just because an individual um, acts like he knows what he's talking about, right? When these individuals are actually bringing the actual proof, right? Not just talking like how these individuals uh, casually like to talk their way out of everything, right? There's always a reason for something, right? Like they always have the reason, because this is like that or that is like that. You know what I mean? At a convenient, right? But like I said, somebody could say whatever they want, but evidence doesn't lie, bro. So you can't be mad at that, right? But like I said, this is not the only genre on YouTube that has this problem or that people see this as a problem. But that's just within social media, because there is people out there that try to pull a fast one, and there is righteous people that will call them out on it. And you can't be mad at these individuals for trying to do the right thing. That's not hating. Hating is if these individuals don't have any evidence, don't have any proof, and just insult these individuals and make up shit about them. Then that's an individual that's hating. You see the difference? But overall, that's just my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Leave it in the comments. Shadow, we out.